Welcome. Tonight we are going into the forest. Not a forest you have walked in before, not the managed forests of parks and nature reserves where the trails are marked and the distances are known and the sounds at night are familiar enough to be comforting. We are going into the rainforest of Central Africa, into the equatorial green, the place where the continent receives more rain than almost anywhere else on Earth, and where the canopy closes above you so completely that the sky disappears and the world is reduced to layered shades of green, and the sound of water moving through leaves and the calls of animals you cannot see. We are going into the forest because the animals we are here to meet tonight live there, have always lived there, have shaped the forest and been shaped by it over millions of years in a relationship so close and so long that separating one from the other is impossible. We are going to spend tonight with gorillas. Find your position now. Let the weight of your body settle into the surface beneath you, the way a gorilla settles into its night nest, the bed of bent branches and folded vegetation that it builds every evening before sleep. A new nest every night, freshly made. The construction taking perhaps 5 minutes and producing a platform of green that is both mattress and insulation. The gorilla's engineering response to sleeping on the ground or in the low branches of a tree in a forest where the temperature drops at night and the ground is cold and damp. The nest is rebuilt every evening. The materials are fresh. The gorilla does not sleep in the same place twice. It builds, sleeps, wakes, and moves on, leaving behind it the compressed circle of vegetation that is one of the signs the trackers look for when they are following a group through the forest, the morning evidence of where the gorillas were and therefore the beginning of finding where they are now. Your breathing is slowing. The forest is around you, or it is in your mind, which is the same thing for the purposes of this hour. The light is low and green, the light that comes through the canopy of a dense rainforest where the leaves overlap and the gaps are few, a light that is constant and soft, and that does not change with time of day the way the light outside the forest changes, because the canopy filters the sun's angle out of the equation and delivers to the forest floor a diffuse even glow that makes the interior of the forest seem to exist outside of normal time, outside of the daily cycle of bright and dim that the open world experiences. In the forest, time moves differently. The gorilla knows this, though it does not know it in words. The gorilla's day is organized around the forest's rhythms rather than the sky's, around the distribution of food plants and water and safe sleeping sites, around the social rhythms of the group, around the needs of the infants and the decisions of the silverback. Let that word settle. Silverback. The adult male gorilla in his full maturity, the massive body, the wide, flat face, the small eyes that carry more intelligence than their size suggests, and across the back and the sides, from the neck to the hips, the fur that has turned silver, the color of iron or of winter light, the silver that marks the male as fully adult, sexually mature, socially dominant, the individual around whom the group organizes its life and its movement and its decisions. The silverback is not simply the leader. The silverback is the center of gravity of the group, the fixed point around which the others orbit, the presence that defines the territory and the routines and the social dynamics that constitute gorilla life. When the silverback moves, the group moves. When the silverback stops, the group stops. When the silverback decides to rest in the afternoon heat and build a temporary day nest and close his eyes, the group spreads around him and does the same, the infants climbing on their mothers, and the juveniles playing at the edges of the resting cluster, and the females settling into their own nests, and the whole social unit taking its cue from the decision of the one animal at its center. Let that number come into the conversation now, the way it always comes into conversations about gorillas, because it is always the first thing and the most important thing, and the thing that gives every other fact its context. There are approximately 100,000 western lowland gorillas left in the world. There are approximately 3,500 Grauers gorillas, the eastern lowland species. There are approximately 1,060 mountain gorillas, the subspecies that lives at altitude in the Virunga mountains and in the Bwindi forest of Uganda, the gorilla of the documentary films and the conservation campaigns, the gorilla that David Attenborough sat among in 1979 in footage that is among the most watched wildlife film ever made, the gorilla whose population has been slowly and painstakingly increasing over the past 3 decades, from a low of about 600 individuals to the current 1,000+ through sustained conservation effort that is one of the most complete success stories in the history of wildlife conservation, complicated and difficult, and never finished but real, measurable, ongoing. 105,000 gorillas. That is the rough total. In a world that has 8 billion people, in an Africa that has 400 million people living in or near the Great Apes forest range, in a forest that is being cleared at rates that, though slowed by conservation efforts in some areas, continue to reduce the habitat available to the gorillas and to every other forest species. 105,000 gorillas is not many, but it is not zero. And the fact that it is not zero is the result of decisions made by people and governments and communities and conservation organizations over the past 50 years that chose to act, to protect, to invest in the preservation of an animal that is our closest living relative after the chimpanzee. Closest relative, this is the phrase that always comes up, and it is precise. The gorilla and the human share approximately 98.3% of their DNA. The genetic distance between a gorilla and a human is smaller than the genetic distance between a gorilla and a gibbon, smaller than the genetic distance between a house cat and a lion, smaller than the distance between a horse and a zebra. Gorillas and humans share not just a percentage of genetic sequence, but specific genes, specific regulatory regions, specific proteins, specific biochemical pathways, the same fundamental cellular machinery operating in cells that are recognizably similar at the molecular level, performing the same basic functions of respiration and reproduction and development that all mammalian cells perform. The gorilla is not like us. The gorilla is us in a different form, us in the form that the forest made, just refracted through 8 million years of separate evolutionary history in separate environments, pursuing separate ecological strategies that produced 2 animals so different in their way of life and so similar in their biology that studying one illuminates the other in ways that would not be possible if they were as different as their appearances suggest. 8 million years. The gorilla lineage and the human lineage diverged approximately 8 to 10 million years ago in the Miocene forests of Africa, from a common ancestor that looked and behaved in ways that neither the modern gorilla nor the modern human fully represents. Since that divergence, the 2 lineages have been on separate evolutionary journeys, each shaped by the specific demands of their specific environments. The gorilla remaining in the forest and becoming what the forest made of it, the human lineage moving to more open environments and becoming what the savanna and the steppe and eventually the entire planet made of it. 8 million years is long in the context of mammalian evolution, long enough to produce the very different animals that the gorilla and the human are today. It is also short in the context of deep evolutionary time, short enough that the fundamental biological unity of the 2 lineages is still clearly readable in every cell. Close your eyes now, or let them soften. The forest is around you, and the light is the filtered green of the canopy, and the sound is the sound of a forest that is always making sound, never fully silent, the drip of water from leaf to leaf, the calls of birds in the mid-canopy, the distant crash of a large animal moving through the undergrowth, the creak of a tree under its own weight. You are in the forest. The gorilla is somewhere nearby, in the understory, in the dense vegetation where the large body moves with less disruption than you would expect, using the paths between the trunks and the gaps in the vegetation that have been used by gorillas in this forest for generations. The routes that are not paths in the human sense, but that are maintained by use, the vegetation on either side, knowing the gorilla's shoulder width and accommodating it. The western lowland gorilla. Gorilla, gorilla, gorilla. The triple-named species, the most numerous of the gorillas, living in the rainforests of the Congo Basin and the forests of West Africa, in Cameroon and the Central African Republic, and the Republic of the Congo and Gabon and Equatorial Guinea. The most extensive gorilla range and the least accessible to research, the dense lowland rainforest making observation difficult, and the remoteness of much of the range making the research infrastructure hard to maintain. The western lowland gorilla is what most people picture when they picture a gorilla, the large black animal of the zoo exhibit and the wildlife documentary. Though the reality of the western lowland gorilla in the wild is substantially different from the captive animal, which is a reduced and simplified version of an animal whose full complexity only emerges in the specific conditions of the wild. The mountain gorilla. Gorilla beringei, the subspecies of the eastern gorilla that lives at altitude between 2,000 and 4,000 meters in the Virunga volcanoes and in Bwindi, in a habitat that is cooler and less humid than the lowland rainforest, and that requires specific adaptations. The mountain gorilla's fur longer and thicker than the lowland gorilla's fur, an insulation against the cold nights at altitude that can drop to near freezing. The mountain gorilla's range is the most restricted of any gorilla, confined to a few protected areas in Rwanda and Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, a remnant of what was once a larger range reduced by habitat loss and hunting and conflict to the few hundred square kilometers of protected forest that remain. The mountain gorilla lives entirely within protected areas. There are no unprotected mountain gorilla populations. Every individual alive today lives within the boundaries of a national park or a conservation area. The mountain gorilla's survival depends entirely on the continued protection of those specific parcels of forest by the governments and communities and conservation organizations that have committed to that protection and has done so more or less effectively for the past several decades. The gorilla's day begins before yours. In the forest, the group begins to stir as the first light reaches the canopy. The infants waking and nursing, and the females stretching, and the juveniles beginning the play that will occupy them for much of the morning. The silverback wakes last, or wakes when the group's movement wakes him, and he rises from his night nest and sits for a moment in the morning stillness, and then begins to move, and the group assembles around him, and the day begins. The direction of travel is the silverback's decision. He knows the range. He has been in this forest for his entire adult life, building the mental map of it that every silverback builds over years of ranging, the locations of the food plants in each season, the water sources, the areas of dense vegetation that offer shelter from rain, the clearings where the sunlight reaches the forest floor, and where the herbs that the gorillas prefer grow in abundance. The silverback navigates the group through the forest toward food, and the group follows. The gorilla eats for most of the morning. The western lowland gorilla in the forest is predominantly a frugivore, eating fruit when it is available, which in the diverse forest of the Congo basin means eating a great variety of fruit species as they come into season across the year. The gorilla's knowledge of the forest, including a sophisticated awareness of the phenology of dozens of fruit species, which trees fruit in which months, where in the range the ripe fruit is at any given time, how to route the day's travel to maximize the encounter with ripe fruit. This knowledge is not instinctive. It is learned, accumulated over years of ranging in the forest with the group, the younger animals learning from the older animals where the food is. The social transmission of ecological knowledge that is one of the foundations of great ape intelligence and that produces in the gorilla a relationship with the specific forest it inhabits that is as detailed and as specific as any relationship between an animal and its home. The mountain gorilla is more of a herbivore than the western lowland gorilla, because the montane forest at altitude has less fruit than the lowland rainforest, and the mountain gorilla has adapted its diet to the vegetation that the high-altitude forest provides, eating stems and leaves and roots and bark, and the wild celery and thistles and nettles of the alpine meadows at the highest elevations of its range. The mountain gorilla consumes enormous quantities of vegetation every day, tens of kilograms of plant material, processing it in the large digestive system that is the gorilla's primary energy extraction mechanism, the gut fermenting the plant cell walls that the gorilla's own enzymes cannot break down, and releasing the energy stored in the cellulose through microbial action in the hindgut. The gorilla is, among the great apes, the most committed herbivore, the one whose body is most adapted to the extraction of energy from plant material, the large belly and the slow digestion, and the preference for high volume, relatively low-calorie food, all reflecting the evolutionary history of an animal that has been living on the vegetation of the African forest for millions of years. The social group. A gorilla group typically contains one silverback, several adult females, their offspring at various stages of development, and sometimes a younger subordinate male who has not yet left to establish his own group. The group is held together by the relationships between its members, primarily the relationships between each female and the silverback, relationships that are affiliative rather than coercive, maintained through proximity and grooming and the day-to-day social interactions of animals that have been living together for years and that have established a social fabric through the accumulation of those interactions. The silverback does not keep the females in the group by force. He keeps them by being, in their assessment, the best available option, the individual most capable of protecting the group from rival males and from predators, the individual whose range knowledge and whose social competence and whose physical capability make the group safer and better fed than they would be alone or in a group led by a less capable male. Breathe slowly. The group is moving through the forest now, the silverback in the lead or off to one side, while a female leads the actual direction of travel, the infants riding on their mothers' backs, the juveniles ranging at the edges of the group, the whole social unit moving through the forest in the unhurried way of animals that have all the time they need. They move through the undergrowth with less noise than you would expect. The large bodies adapted to the forest in the way that large bodies can be adapted to complex environments when the animal has grown up in that environment and knows it intimately. The gorilla does not crash through the forest. It moves through the forest, using the gaps and the established roots, bending the stems that are in the way and releasing them as it passes. The gorilla's hands. The hands of the gorilla are the most immediately recognizable feature of the animal's kinship with humans. The wide palms and the long fingers and the opposable thumb, the nails rather than claws, the fingerprints that are unique to each individual in the same way that human fingerprints are unique, the creases and the lines and the texture of the skin that vary from individual to individual and that are, if you know how to read them, as identifying as a face. The gorilla's hands are used for feeding, for social grooming, for nest building, for communication, for play, for climbing, for knuckle walking on the ground. The hands functioning in all of these contexts with a flexibility and a precision that reflects the long evolutionary history of the primate hand, the structure that more than any other single anatomical feature defines the order primates, and that has, in the human lineage, become the tool that built the world we live in. The gorilla knuckle walks. It does not walk upright, except briefly in certain social contexts. The display of the silverback, or the bipedal posture, assumed when the hands are needed for carrying food. The gorilla moves on the ground on all fours, but not on the palms of the hands. It walks on the middle knuckles of the fingers curled and the weight borne on the dorsal surface of the middle phalanges, a posture that keeps the hands off the ground and that allows the long fingers to function as weight-bearing columns while remaining available for other uses. Knuckle walking is not a compromise between bipedalism and quadrupedalism. It is a specific adaptation that evolved in the African ape lineage independently of any human walking. A solution to the problem of how to support a large, heavy body on the ground while retaining the long, grasping hands that life in the trees and feeding on fruits and vegetation requires. The silverback's display. When a rival male approaches, or when the group is threatened, or sometimes for reasons that are not immediately obvious to human observers, the silverback performs the display that has made the gorilla famous, and that is, in its full execution, one of the most impressive behavioral performances in the animal kingdom. It begins with hooting calls that accelerate in pace and volume, the silverback standing upright or staying on all fours while the calls rise to a crescendo. Then the chest beats, both hands alternating in a rapid tattoo on the pectoral muscles, producing a sound that carries through the forest for hundreds of meters and that announces the displayer's presence, size, and social status to every gorilla in the area. Then a sideways run, crashing through the vegetation, tearing branches, throwing foliage. The whole sequence lasting perhaps 30 seconds and ending with a ground slap, both palms on the earth, a final punctuation. The display is threat and information simultaneously. It is the silverback saying, "I am here, I am large, I am capable, and if you are thinking about testing me, you should think carefully." The chest beat is not, as popular culture has sometimes suggested, a random aggressive behavior. It is a structured communication, the sound produced varying with the size of the animal. The larger the chest, the lower and louder the sound, giving rival males at a distance a reliable acoustic assessment of the displayer's body size without requiring a visual encounter. The chest beat is honest signaling, the physical law of acoustics ensuring that a smaller animal cannot produce the same sound as a larger one, regardless of its effort, so that the sound carries accurate information about the animal's size and therefore about the likely outcome of a physical confrontation. Gorillas assess each other through their displays, rather than through their fights. The display usually settling the question of relative dominance without either animal needing to risk the injury that a physical fight between two large, powerful primates would involve. The gorilla's memory. Individual gorillas are recognized by the researchers who study them for decades. The long-term study sites at Bwindi and in the Virungas have produced individual life histories stretching back 40 years or more. Records of births and deaths and group transfers and dominance changes that are detailed enough to allow analysis of the factors that influence gorilla survival and reproduction, in the same way that long-term studies of human populations allow demographic analysis. In these records, the gorillas appear as individuals, each one with its own temperament and its own history and its own specific relationships with specific other individuals that persist over years. The researchers who spend years in the field with specific gorilla groups describe relationships with individual animals that are as specific and as textured as any long-term human acquaintance, each animal known in its individuality, its specific behaviors and preferences and reactions, its position in the social fabric of the group, its history. The gorilla is not a type. It is an individual, and it has been an individual for its entire life, known as an individual to the other members of its group, each of whom maintains specific relationships with each of the others in the way that all long-term social groups maintain specific relationships between their members. The gorilla infant. Born after an 8.5-month gestation weighing about 2 kilograms, the infant gorilla is the most helpless newborn of any of the great apes, unable to support its own weight, unable to cling independently for the first few weeks of life, requiring constant physical contact with its mother and constant support from her hands. The mother carries the infant against her chest for the first weeks, cradling it, supporting its head, nursing it on demand. The infant suckling stimulating the milk production that will sustain it for the next 3 to 4 years. The infant begins to experiment with locomotion at a few months old, the first tentative crawling movements on the mother's body, and by 6 months is riding on the mother's back, the gorilla form of the infant carrier that every human culture has independently invented. The infant on the back, leaving the mother's hands free for feeding and locomotion, while keeping the infant in physical contact with her and able to nurse when it needs to. The juvenile years, the period between weaning and puberty, from about 3 years to about 8 years old, is the gorilla's childhood, and it has the same quality of play-oriented, socially embedded learning that characterizes the childhoods of the other great apes and of human children. The juvenile gorilla plays. It wrestles and chases with other juveniles. It climbs and falls and tries things and fails at them and tries again. It observes the adults in the group and experiments with the behaviors it sees, the food processing, the nest building, the social interactions, all of the things it will need to do as an adult. Practiced in the low-stakes context of juvenile play, where mistakes have low consequences, and the corrections of more experienced individuals are available. The juvenile gorilla is accumulating the behavioral repertoire of adult gorilla life through practice and observation and social learning, in the same way that human children accumulate the behavioral repertoire of adult human life, and the parallel is not accidental. It is the same process, the same neural architecture doing the same thing, the prolonged juvenile period that the great apes share, being one of the features that makes them what they are, the biological substrate for the kind of learning and the kind of social complexity that distinguishes the great apes from most other primates. The rain. In the forest it rains often. The equatorial rainforest exists because the equatorial atmosphere receives more solar energy than any other part of the Earth's surface, and the evapotranspiration of the forest itself recycles enormous quantities of water into the atmosphere, and both of these factors produce the frequent and heavy rainfall that maintains the forest, 2,000 millimeters or more of rainfall per year in the Congo Basin, falling sometimes in brief intense downpours and sometimes in long steady rains that continue for hours. The gorilla has no shelter from the rain. It does not build structures that keep the rain out. It sits in the rain, or it sits under the canopy, where the leaf cover is dense enough to intercept some of the rainfall before it reaches the ground, and it waits for the rain to stop. The adults sitting hunched and patient, and the infants tucked against their mothers, and the juveniles, who lack the patience of the adults, still playing but more subdued, the rain reducing the energy of everything in the group to the minimum that the temperature and the wetness and the discomfort of being a large warm-blooded animal in a tropical downpour permits. The gorilla in the rain is not miserable in the way a human would be miserable in the rain without shelter. It is inconvenienced. It is doing what you do when the weather is bad and you have nowhere to go, which is to sit it out, to be patient, to accept the condition as a temporary feature of the environment rather than a crisis requiring action. The gorilla's patience in the rain is of a piece with the gorilla's patience in general. The patience of an animal that has learned, through the slow accumulation of experience in a complex environment, that most things pass, that the rain stops, and the fruit ripens, and the rival moves on, and the infant stops crying, and the day reaches its end, and the nest is built and the sleep comes. The gorilla is patient. It has a lot to be patient about. The forest is full of things that require waiting for. The night nest. We return to the beginning. The evening is coming and the group has fed through the afternoon and the silverback is beginning to slow, the signals of the late day recognizable to the group as the indication that the day's travel is ending, that the night sight is close, that the building is about to begin. The female breaks branches and folds them under her, bending the stems of the surrounding vegetation into the circular platform that is the gorilla's only construction, the only thing the gorilla builds. The nest takes 5 minutes. It is adequate. It is not elaborate. The gorilla does not invest in permanent structures, does not accumulate possessions, does not build for the future beyond the immediate future of tonight's sleep. The nest is built and used and left, and tomorrow another nest will be built somewhere else, and the gorilla's relationship with its home is not the relationship of an owner to a property, but of a traveler to a stopping place, each one good enough for tonight, and tomorrow there will be another. The infant is nested beside its mother, or on her, the physical contact of sleep maintained as the physical contact of waking is maintained, the mother's body, the infant's primary reference point in the world, the source of warmth and nutrition and protection, and the foundation from which all exploration proceeds and to which all returns are made. The juvenile has built its own crude nest near the mother, the nest-building skill still imperfect, the platform less stable than an adult's, but adequate for the night. The silverback's nest is the largest, a wide platform of bent branches, the construction accomplished with the efficiency of an animal that has built thousands of nests and that has learned what works and what doesn't, what species of plant make good nest material and what species collapse under weight, which sites are level enough and which are not. The forest is dark now, not gradually dark the way the sky darkens in open country as the sun goes down, but suddenly dark, the canopy cutting off the last light quickly, once the sun reaches a low enough angle that it no longer reaches through the gaps in the leaves. The forest at night has a darkness that is different from the darkness of a field or a desert or an open ocean, a darkness that is contained, that has texture and sound, that is full of the nocturnal organisms beginning their activity, the insects and the frogs and the small mammals that the forest shelters, the sounds that the gorilla has heard every night of its life and that form the acoustic backdrop of its sleep, the familiar sounds of the familiar forest in the dark. The gorilla sleeps. The silverback's eyes close. The infant nurses and sleeps. The group is quiet. The whole social unit at rest. The daytime tensions and the social negotiations and the decisions about direction and the competition over fruit and the play and the grooming and the display, all suspended for the hours of darkness that the forest provides. The group sleeps in the proximity that is both its social structure and its physical warmth. The bodies close enough that movement by one is felt by the others. The social fabric maintained even in sleep. The group still a group, even when no one is awake to observe it. The gorilla and the forest. The relationship between the gorilla and the forest it inhabits is not one-directional, not the animal simply taking from the environment what it needs. The gorilla is a seed disperser of enormous importance to the forest, consuming fruit at every opportunity and depositing the seeds of the fruit plants in its dung across the range. The seeds protected from digestion by their hard coats and deposited in a ready-made bed of fertilizer. The gorilla's feces providing the nutrients that germinate the seed and launch the next generation of the fruit trees that sustain the gorilla. A single gorilla group ranging over a territory of many square kilometers deposits the seeds of dozens of fruit species every day, maintaining the composition of the forest's understory and canopy in a way that reflects the gorilla's feeding preferences and ranging patterns. The forest around a long-occupied gorilla range is, in part, a product of the gorillas that have been living in it. The fruit tree composition shaped by what the gorillas ate and where they walked and where they deposited the evidence of what they ate. The gorilla is making the forest. The forest is making the gorilla. The two are a single system. The clearings. In the lowland rainforest of Central Africa, there are open areas in the forest called bays or clearings, places where the canopy is absent or reduced and where the groundwater comes close to the surface, and where sodium and mineral-rich vegetation grows that the forest plants elsewhere do not offer. The bays are the places where forest elephants and buffalo and other large animals gather to consume the mineral-rich vegetation. And gorillas also visit them, the western lowland gorillas especially, wading into the shallow water of the forest swamp in groups that would not be tolerated in the denser forest. Their interactions in the bay governed by different rules from their forest interactions. The open space and the abundance of the mineral vegetation reducing the competition that normally structures their encounters. The BI observations have been among the most productive in gorilla research. The open conditions allowing the long-range observation that is impossible in the dense lowland forest, and the researchers who have spent years at the bay study sites describe the gorilla interactions they have observed there as some of the most complex and most surprising behaviors documented in wild gorillas. Grooming. In the social life of the gorilla, as in the social lives of all the great apes, grooming is the currency of affiliation, the physical act of searching through another individual's fur for parasites and debris that is, among primates, simultaneously practical and social, simultaneously a service and a statement of relationship. Grooming is not done randomly between any two individuals. It is done preferentially, more frequently between individuals who are closer socially. The frequency and duration of grooming exchanges reflecting the strength and the nature of the social bond between the animals involved. A female who grooms the silverback is affirming her relationship with the dominant male. An individual who is groomed by the silverback is receiving a social signal of considerable value, an indication of the silverback's assessment of the relationship. The juveniles groom each other in the extensive, playful way of young animals for whom grooming is as much exploration as social maintenance. The mother grooms her infant with the focused attention of an individual for whom the clean and parasite-free condition of the infant is both a health imperative and a social expression. The care of the infant visible to every member of the group and signaling the mother's investment in her offspring. The gorilla's intelligence. The gorilla has been the subject of significant research into great ape cognition since the 1970s, when researchers first began to ask seriously what the great apes were capable of understanding and expressing. The gorilla Coco, raised by researcher Francine Patterson and taught American Sign Language, became famous for the size of her vocabulary and the apparent sophistication of her use of it, producing novel combinations of signs to describe objects and concepts she had not been taught specific signs for, responding to questions in ways that seemed to demonstrate comprehension and intentionality, and in some of the most discussed instances, a capacity for reflection about her own emotional states. The interpretation of Coco's language use has been debated by cognitive scientists ever since, and the debate about what the gorilla's sign language use does and does not demonstrate about gorilla cognition continues. What is not debated is that Coco demonstrated a level of communicative flexibility and a capacity for learned symbolic behavior that was, before the language research with great apes began, not considered possible in any non-human animal. Wild gorilla cognition has been assessed through different means, through the observation of problem-solving behavior in the field, through experimental studies with captive animals, through the analysis of the complexity of their social behavior. What the research consistently shows is an animal with a working memory, an ability to form categories, a capacity for causal reasoning, and a level of social intelligence that tracks the behavior and the intentions of specific other individuals over long periods. The gorilla remembers, it anticipates, it makes inferences about what other individuals know and intend. These capacities are not human capacities. They are not human level, but they are the same capacities operating through the same neural architecture at a level of sophistication that places the gorilla clearly in the category of cognitively complex animals whose inner lives are not simply reflexive, not simply stimulus and response, but involve something that functions like representation, like memory of specific past events, like anticipation of specific future ones. The gorilla's voice. The gorilla is not, as popular imagery suggests, a particularly loud animal in its normal social life. The dramatic chest-beating display is the exception. The normal acoustic communication of the gorilla group is quiet, intimate, suited to the proximity in which the group members live. The belch vocalization, a low rumbling sound produced during feeding and resting, is the most common gorilla vocalization, a contact call that says, "I am here, I am relaxed, all is well." A continuous low-level acoustic signal that maintains the group's awareness of each member's location and emotional state without requiring visual contact through the dense vegetation. The infants produce a range of vocalizations that are more obviously emotional, whimpers when distressed, screams when frightened, the pleasure sounds of nursing. The silverback's vocalizations include the belch, and also a deep rumble of contentment and a sharp bark of alarm, and the building hoots of the display sequence, a vocal repertoire that covers the range of social situations a gorilla encounters, and that is like the vocalizations of all the great apes, learned rather than entirely innate, each individual developing its specific vocal expressions through experience in the social group. The gorilla and the human gaze. When a gorilla looks at you, it is a different experience from being looked at by almost any other animal. The eyes are set in a face that is recognizably a face, framed by the wide flat features of the gorilla's skull, in a way that does not look like a human face, but that is clearly of the same general type. A face that has a nose and eyes and a mouth arranged in approximately the same spatial relationships as a human face. The eyes set forward in the skull for the stereoscopic vision that the climbing life of the primate ancestor required. The gorilla's eyes are dark brown, the iris barely distinguishable from the pupil in low light, the eyes large and round and set under the prominent brow ridge that gives the gorilla its characteristic stern expression even when the animal is completely relaxed. When the gorilla looks at you, it is looking at you with an intelligence that you can feel, a directed attention that is evaluating you, placing you in the context of the gorilla's social world, assessing what you are and what you intend, and whether you are a threat or an irrelevance or something more interesting than either. The researchers who have habituated gorilla groups to human presence for tourism and research describe the first moment of full mutual gaze with a habituated gorilla as one of the defining experiences of their professional lives. The moment when the distance between the human and the gorilla collapses, and what remains is two animals of the same basic type looking at each other across 8 million years of separate history. The gorilla does not have language. It does not have the capacity for the abstract reasoning that produces language and technology and civilization. But in that gaze, in the moment of the mutual attention, there is something that is not easily named, but that is not nothing. Something that the researchers who have felt it have called recognition, the experience of being known by something other than a human, seen by it, assessed by it, found interesting or uninteresting or threatening or unthreatening, the relationship between two intelligences that share a common origin. The forest at night. We return to the sleeping group. The light has been gone for hours now, and the forest is in the darkness that is complete beneath the canopy. The stars invisible through the leaves, the only light the faint luminescence of certain fungi on the forest floor, and the occasional brief flash of a firefly in the understory. The gorillas are asleep in their nests, the breathing of the large bodies audible in the quiet. The infant occasionally making a small sound as it shifts position against its mother. The forest sounds continue around them, the katydids and the tree frogs and the distant call of a nightjar, the drip of the condensation from the leaves, the occasional crack of a branch settling. The silverback sleeps on his back or his side, the massive body at rest. The intelligence that navigates the group through the forest and manages its social life and protects it from rivals suspended in sleep. The brain doing what the brain does in sleep, consolidating the day's experience, repairing and maintaining, preparing for tomorrow. The silverback has been in this forest for 20 years. He was born here, in this range, in this group, to a mother whose own range he now travels in modified form. The slight adjustments of each generation's ranging patterns accumulating over time into the cultural knowledge of the lineage. He knows this forest the way you know a room in your house, in the dark, by feel, and by the specific knowledge of where everything is, where the fruit trees are and where the clearings are and where the slopes are too steep for comfortable travel and where the water is in the dry season. He will be in this forest for perhaps another 20 years, leading the group through the seasons of fruit abundance and fruit scarcity, managing the social tensions and the rival males and the needs of the infants and the decisions of the females. He will do what the silverbacks before him did, what the silverbacks after him will do, in the forest that was here before him and that will be here after him. The threat. The gorilla's world is not safe. It has never been fully safe. Predators have always been present, leopards most significantly. The only large predator capable of taking a gorilla, taking primarily the infants and the juveniles and the isolated individuals, the predator that the group's cohesion and the silverback's vigilance and the display's deterrence function are all partly directed against. But the threat that the gorilla faces now is different from the threat of the leopard. The threat now comes from outside the forest's ecology, from the loss of the forest itself to the expanding agricultural frontier, from the hunting of gorillas for the bushmeat trade that supplies protein to the growing human populations of Central Africa, from the infectious diseases to which the gorilla, with its genetic proximity to humans, is catastrophically vulnerable, from the conflict and instability in the region that disrupts the conservation infrastructure that has kept the gorilla populations alive. Ebola, the hemorrhagic fever that has killed more gorillas than any other disease in the past 30 years, erupting periodically through gorilla populations in the Congo Basin and the forests of Gabon and Cameroon, killing 60 to 90% of the individuals it infects, moving through a gorilla group like a fire through dry wood, leaving behind it a silence where there was community. The Ebola outbreaks of the 1990s and 2000s killed tens of thousands of western lowland gorillas and great apes and fundamentally altered the population structure of some forest areas, eliminating entire groups from their ranges and leaving the forest empty in places where gorillas had been for generations. The disease continues to circulate in the forest, its reservoir in some bat species or other wildlife host that has not yet been definitively identified, and the threat of another outbreak is continuous. The conservation. And yet the gorilla persists. It persists in the forests of the Congo Basin and the mountains of the Virungas and Bwindi, in reduced numbers and in ranges reduced from their historical extent, but persists, the populations monitored, and the ranges protected, and the threats managed as well as the resources and the political will available allow. The mountain gorilla's recovery from 600 individuals in the 1980s to more than 1,000 today is the result of sustained conservation effort, of the veterinary interventions that have treated injured and sick individuals, of the anti-poaching patrols that have protected the forest, of the community conservation programs that have given the people living adjacent to the gorilla forest an economic interest in its preservation, of the tourism revenue that has made the gorilla worth more alive than dead to the governments and the communities that share its range, the people who work in gorilla conservation, the trackers who follow the groups every day through the dense forest, the veterinarians who treat the injured animals, the rangers who patrol the boundaries of the parks, the researchers who spend years in the field building the knowledge base that informs the conservation, The community liaison officers who work with the farmers and the schools and the local leaders adjacent to the parks. The government officials who make and implement the policies that protect the forest. These are the people who have kept the gorilla alive through the past 50 years of pressure. And they are still there, still working, still patrolling, still treating, still educating, still arguing for the forest and the animals in it, in the face of the enormous human needs that compete for the same land. The gorilla does not know about conservation. It does not know that it is endangered. It does not know that the humans who come to watch it from a respectful distance and who pay a substantial fee for the privilege are part of the economic argument for its survival. It does not know that the trackers who follow it every day and record its behavior and its health status are maintaining a data set that will be used to inform decisions about its future. It lives in the forest the way it has always lived in the forest, following the silverback, eating the fruit, building the nest, nursing the infant, grooming and playing and displaying and sleeping, the daily rhythms of a life that is fully occupied by the demands of being a gorilla in a forest, which is demanding enough and sufficient enough that there is no room in it for awareness of the larger context, the human world pressing in from every direction, the forest shrinking, the climate shifting, the future uncertain. The gorilla is fully present. This is what the people who spend time with habituated gorilla groups consistently report: the quality of the gorilla's attention to its immediate environment, the focus on the social and the physical world directly around it, the complete investment in the present moment that is the gorilla's natural state. The gorilla is not worried about tomorrow. It is not calculating next year. It is eating this fruit, grooming this companion, watching this infant, navigating this social dynamic, building this nest. The present is total. The gorilla is always exactly where it is. Let your breathing slow now to the rhythm of that presence, the complete absorption in the moment that the gorilla inhabits, the quality of attention that requires no effort because it is not directed at anything other than what is immediately here. The forest is quiet around the sleeping group. The night sounds are constant and familiar. The silverback's breathing is deep and slow. The infant is tucked against its mother. The juveniles are still. The forest is doing what the forest always does, which is to continue to breathe and grow and drip and call and live in all its layers and all its complexity, indifferent to the sleeping mammals in its midst and sustaining them anyway, as it has sustained the gorillas that have slept in its nests for millions of years. 8 million years of sleeping in the forest, 8 million years of building the night nest and closing the eyes and letting the forest sounds be the last thing heard before the sleep comes. 8 million years of the same darkness and the same sounds and the same slow breathing of the social group at rest, the infants tucked against their mothers and the silverback in his large nest, and the forest going on around all of them, as it always has, as it will continue to, for as long as the forest is there and the gorillas are in it. Be still now. Let the last thought settle. Let the breathing slow to the level of the gorilla's breathing in its nest, deep and slow and regular. The breathing of a large warm-blooded animal fully at rest in a familiar place, fully embedded in a social group, fully secure in the knowledge that the night is normal and the forest is safe, and the morning will come with its fruit and its movement and its social complexity, as it always does, as it has always done. The gorilla is asleep. The forest is around it. The darkness is full of the forest's sounds, and you are very nearly asleep. The night is quiet. The breathing has found the rhythm that belongs to the deep hours, the rhythm of the body at its most settled, the mind at its most distant from the day. The gorilla is in its nest in the forest in Central Africa, 8 million years of evolutionary history, pressing it gently into the bent branches of its bed, the infant sleeping against the mother, the silverback's eyes closed, the silver fur of his back catching no light, because there is no light to catch. The forest breathes. The group breathes. You breathe. Sleep now. The gorilla is in the forest. The forest is old. The night holds everything. Sleep. The Virunga volcanoes, the chain of 8 volcanoes that straddles the borders of Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, rising from the floor of the Albertine Rift to altitudes above 4,000 meters, the peaks of some still smoking, the flanks covered in a mosaic of bamboo forest and Hagenia woodland and Afro-alpine heath, and the dense mixed forest that the mountain gorillas prefer. The Virungas have a history of violence and a history of conservation that are intertwined in ways that are difficult to separate. The park that protects the Congolese portion of the gorilla range, Virunga National Park, is Africa's oldest national park, established in 1925, and it has been the site of conflict and crisis for decades, the instability of the region and the resources within the park making it a focus of the armed groups that have operated in eastern Congo since the 1990s. Rangers have been killed protecting it. Gorillas have been killed within it. The park has been invaded and occupied and damaged by forces that the conservation community has had to work around and negotiate with, and sometimes confront directly. And still the gorillas are there. Still the rangers patrol. Still the researchers follow the groups through the bamboo forests and the Hagenia woodland. Still the tourism brings visitors from around the world to sit for an hour in the company of a habituated family group, paying the fees that support the conservation that has kept the mountain gorilla alive. The daily range. The gorilla group does not travel far in a day by the standards of some large mammals. The average daily range of a mountain gorilla group is perhaps 1 to 2 kilometers. The movement slow and interrupted by the extended feeding bouts that occupy most of the morning and afternoon. The western lowland gorilla may range a little further, following the distribution of ripe fruit across a larger territory, but even the most active gorilla groups rarely cover more than a few kilometers in a day. The gorilla's energy budget does not require long-distance travel. The forest provides enough in a small area to sustain the group without the long migrations that the more mobile large mammals of the open savanna undertake. The gorilla's relationship with its range is one of deep familiarity with a small area, the detailed knowledge of a small home territory that comes from decades of living in the same forest and learning its rhythms and its resources in every season. The alpha position and succession. When the silverback of a group ages and weakens, or when he dies, the group faces a crisis of succession whose resolution determines the future of the group. A young silverback from within the group, if one has been tolerated by the dominant male as a subordinate, may take over the group's leadership, or a rival male from outside may challenge for and win the group, in a confrontation that is rarely fatal but that is physically severe. The two large males fighting with a ferocity and a noise that reverberates through the forest. Or the group may disperse, the females and their young attaching themselves to different males in different groups, the social unit dissolving, and its members redistributed through the population. The outcome depends on the ages and the conditions of the individuals involved, and on the specific circumstances of the group at the time of the transition, and it is not predictable in advance. The succession of the silverback is one of the most significant events in a gorilla group's history, the event that determines whether the group continues as a recognizable social unit or whether it fragments and its members begin new affiliations with new individuals. The bamboo feeding. In the mountain gorilla's range, bamboo is a significant seasonal food source, the new bamboo shoots that emerge in the growing season, providing a high-calorie, high-protein food that the gorillas consume in large quantities when it is available. The image of the mountain gorilla feeding on bamboo, sitting back on its haunches and holding the bamboo shoot in both hands, and biting off sections with the apparent satisfaction of an animal consuming something it particularly enjoys, is one of the iconic images of mountain gorilla research and tourism. The large black animal in the green of the bamboo forest with the deliberately focused attention of feeding that makes the gorilla look, in that moment, less like a wild animal and more like a person having lunch. The bamboo is available only for a few months of the year, and the gorillas know exactly when it will be available and route their ranging to be in the bamboo forests during the bamboo season. The seasonal phenology of the bamboo incorporated into the group's annual movement pattern, the way the phenology of the fruit trees is incorporated into the ranging of the lowland gorillas, the gorillas' social bonds between females. Much of the research and the documentation of gorilla social life has focused on the silverback and on his relationship with the group, because he is the most visible and the most dramatic figure in the social structure. But the relationships between the adult females in a group are also significant, more complex and more varied than the simple model of a harem organized around the male, suggests. Females form bonds with each other that persist over years, bonds that are expressed in grooming preferences and in proximity and in the cooperative defense of their offspring against threats. Females with stronger bonds to each other are more likely to support each other in disputes, more likely to be found near each other during the day's travel, more likely to groom each other in preference to other group members. The females are not simply the silverback's companions. They are social actors with their own relationships and their own social strategies, each one managing her position in the group and her relationships with the other females and with the silverback in ways that serve her own reproductive interests and the interests of her offspring. The female transfer. A striking feature of gorilla social organization is that females typically do not stay in their natal group for life. When they reach reproductive maturity, at about 8 years old, female gorillas often transfer out of the group they were born into and join a different group or a solitary silverback who is attempting to establish a new group. The transfer is the female's choice. She leaves voluntarily, assessing the available options, the quality of the silverback, the size and composition of the group, the apparent fitness of the males she encounters during the ranging that brings her into contact with neighboring groups. The transfer behavior means that the social groups of gorillas are not composed of closely related females, as they are in many other social mammals where females are the philopatric sex. Gorilla groups are composed of females who have come from different natal groups and who are not necessarily closely related to each other, the social bonds between them being bonds of familiarity and association rather than kinship. The gorillas laugh, or what functions as a laugh. In play, particularly rough and tumble play between juveniles or between juveniles and adults, gorillas produce a panting vocalization during the exhalation that is structurally similar to human laughter, produced in the same behavioral contexts in which human laughter occurs. During positive social interactions and during play, associated with the relaxed open mouth expression that primates use to signal non-aggression and playful intent. Whether this vocalization is the evolutionary precursor of human laughter, or whether the two evolved independently from a common ancestor's vocalization, in the same behavioral context, is a question of primate evolution that is not fully resolved. What is clear is that gorillas make a sound in play that looks and sounds like laughter, that it occurs when they are having what appears to be fun, and that the observer who hears it for the first time has an immediate and involuntary recognition of it as something familiar, something from their own species' emotional repertoire expressed in a different body, in a different forest, in a different time. The ancient forest. The Congo Basin rainforest is the second largest tropical rainforest in the world, after the Amazon, covering approximately 3 million square kilometers and holding within it a biological diversity that is among the richest on Earth, thousands of plant species and hundreds of mammal species, and thousands of bird species and insects and amphibians, in numbers that have not been fully catalogued. The forest has been in something like its current form for millions of years, contracting during the ice ages, when the climate dried and the forest retreated to refugia in wetter areas, and expanding again during the warm interglacials, but always present, always occupying the Congo Basin in some form, always providing the habitat that the gorillas and the forest elephants and the okapi and the bonobos and the hundreds of other species that have evolved to live in it require. The gorilla is a product of this forest, shaped by it over millions of years, carrying in its body and its behavior the adaptations to a specific kind of forest in a specific climate, on a specific continent, the Congo Basin forest, and no other. The forest is being cleared at the margins, the agricultural frontier advancing into it from every direction, as the human population of Central Africa grows and the demand for agricultural land increases. The rate of deforestation in the Congo Basin is lower than in many other tropical forest regions because the Congo Basin countries are among the poorest in the world, and the infrastructure for large-scale commercial agricultural expansion has been limited. But it is not zero, and it is increasing. And the forest that the gorillas have inhabited for millions of years is smaller than it was 100 years ago, and smaller still than it was 1,000 years ago. The edges eaten away by the expanding human presence in a process that is slow by human timescales, but fast by the timescales of the evolutionary history of the gorilla. The forest absorbs carbon. The Congo Basin forest is one of the largest carbon sinks on Earth, absorbing an estimated 600 million tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year, the trees incorporating the carbon into their wood and their roots, and the soil beneath them in the accumulation that has been going on since the forest established itself after the last glaciation. The gorilla, moving through this forest and eating its fruit and depositing its seeds and enriching the soil with its dung, is part of the system that maintains this carbon sink, one of the many organisms whose activity sustains the health and the productivity of the forest, and whose absence would alter the forest's function in ways that would reduce its capacity to absorb carbon and to sustain the diversity of life that depends on it. The gorilla is not only an animal of intrinsic value, a thing worth preserving, because it is extraordinary, and because it is our relative, and because its existence enriches the world. The gorilla is an ecological actor, a functional part of a system that provides services to the entire planet. The carbon sequestration of the Congo Basin forest being one of those services, and the gorilla being one of the agents that maintains the forest in the condition that makes that service possible. Let these facts settle now, not as causes for anxiety but as context, as the larger frame within which the sleeping gorilla and its group exist tonight in the forest, in the dark, in the nest, in the ancient and continuous relationship between the animal and the forest that has produced both of them in their current forms. The gorilla is sleeping, the forest is continuing, the carbon is being absorbed. The seeds are in the dung deposited today and will germinate in the coming season. The infants are nursing and growing. The silverback is sleeping and will wake tomorrow and lead the group to the food that he knows is there, because he has been there before, because his mother was there before him, because the forest has been there for all of it and holds the memory of all of it in its composition. The night is deep now, and the breathing has found its rest, and the thoughts are few and gentle. The gorilla family is asleep in the Congo Basin forest, in the dark and the quiet of the equatorial night, and you are somewhere else, but in the same night. The same dark, the same planetary night that covers everything from the forest to wherever you are. The same continuous dark in which the gorilla sleeps and the forest breathes, and the carbon moves and the seeds wait to germinate, and the whole enormous system of life on this planet continues in its ancient patterns. Sleep. The gorilla is in the forest. The forest is old. The silverback is breathing in his nest. The infant is against its mother. The dark holds everything. Sleep now. The forest is there. The gorilla is there. 8 million years of sleeping in the forest, and tonight is one more night in that long unbroken sequence. The nest is built, the eyes are closed, the forest is quiet, the group is together. Sleep. The gorilla and the rain again. Because rain is so much a part of the gorilla's life that it deserves more than one mention. The equatorial forest is defined by its rainfall, and the gorilla that lives in it has spent its entire existence in a world that is wet more often than it is dry, a world where the ground is never fully dry, where the vegetation retains water on its surfaces after rain and deposits it on the gorilla's fur as it passes through, where the streams are constant and the wallows are accessible, and the morning dew on the leaves provides a source of fresh water that the gorillas use, licking the moisture from the surfaces of the large leaves in the early morning when the dew is heavy. The gorilla's relationship with water is not the crisis management relationship of an animal that lives in a dry environment and must travel to find water. It is a relationship of constant availability, the water always nearby, always accessible. The gorilla's biological systems calibrated for a world in which hydration is not a problem, and the management of excess moisture rather than the pursuit of scarce moisture is the relevant challenge. The body of the gorilla. The physical dimensions of what the gorilla is. An adult male gorilla weighs between 140 and 200 kilograms, the variation reflecting age and the specific subspecies and individual condition. The silverback is the largest primate on Earth. He is wider across the shoulders than most human beings are tall. His arms, used in knuckle walking, are longer in proportion to his body than human arms are, the extra length and adaptation to the climbing life of the primate ancestor that the gorilla has not entirely abandoned despite its predominantly terrestrial lifestyle. His canine teeth, The long pointed teeth in the upper and lower jaw that are visible in threat displays are much larger in males than in females, a sexually dimorphic feature that functions in male-male competition, the large canines being part of the display apparatus and the threat assessment rather than primarily a feeding tool, because the gorilla's diet of vegetation and fruit does not require large canines, and the difference in canine size between males and females is too large to be explained by feeding differences alone. The smell of the gorilla. The researchers who work with habituated gorilla groups describe the smell of the gorilla as one of the immediate and indelible features of the encounter, a smell that is strong and distinctive, and that is, like the smells of all large mammals, an honest signal of the animal's physiological state and social condition, the stress hormones producing a sharper, more pungent smell than the baseline and the relaxed animal producing a musk that is strong but not alarming. The smell of a silverback's armpit glands, which produce a secretion that is involved in social signaling, and that the silverback distributes by rubbing against trees and vegetation in his range, is one of the most intense biological odors that any researcher in primate fieldwork encounters. A smell that carries information about the individual, its size, its hormonal state, its social position, and that other gorillas read and respond to in ways that reflect the information the smell carries. The olfactory world of the gorilla is richer than the olfactory world of the human, and the forest is full of the chemical information that the gorilla reads as it moves through it, its own scent marks and those of neighboring groups, providing a chemical map of territory and recent activity that supplements the visual and auditory information of the forest. The gorilla's relationship with fire, unlike chimpanzees, which have been observed to be fascinated by fire and to approach and monitor controlled burns in their range with an apparent calm that suggests familiarity rather than fear. Gorillas have not been systematically studied in the context of fire, and the literature on gorilla responses to fire is sparse. What is known from the experiences of the communities that live near gorilla forest is that gorillas will move away from fires in their range, retreating deeper into the forest as the smoke and the heat approach, and that they return to burned areas quickly after the fire has passed to exploit the new growth that follows burning, the fresh vegetation that comes up in the weeks after a fire, providing a temporary abundance of the young leaves and shoots that the gorilla prefers. The gorilla's response to fire is practical, neither the fearful flight of an animal with no experience of fire, nor the fascinated engagement of an animal that is beginning to understand fire's utility, but the pragmatic retreat and return of an animal that has been dealing with lightning fires in its forest range for millions of years, and that has learned, in the evolutionary sense, to move away from the immediate danger and return to the post-fire abundance. The bonobo comparison. The gorilla's relationship with the bonobo, the other great ape of the Congo basin, is a relationship of different forests and different ecologies rather than of direct social interaction, because the gorilla and the bonobo do not have overlapping ranges. The bonobo living south of the Congo River, in a forest that the gorilla does not penetrate, the two species separated by the river that is too wide and too swift for either to cross with any regularity. The bonobo is sometimes called the hippie ape, the peaceful ape, the ape that resolves social tension through sexual behavior rather than through aggression. And the contrast between the bonobo's social system and the gorilla's is often drawn to illustrate the range of social solutions that the great ape lineage has produced. The gorilla's social life, organized around the dominance of the silverback and the management of competition through display and threat, is one solution. The bonobo's social life, organized around female alliances and the sexual resolution of conflict, is another. Both work. Both have been sustaining populations of great apes in the Congo basin for millions of years. The forest is large enough for both solutions. The habituation process. Before gorilla groups can be observed closely by researchers or visited by tourists, they must be habituated to human presence, a process that takes 2 years or more, and that involves the daily approach of trackers to the group, the gradual reduction of the group's alarm responses as the trackers become familiar, the slow acceptance of human observers at close range that produces the remarkable experience of sitting with a habituated group as the gorillas go about their business a few meters away, apparently unconcerned by the presence of the quietly seated humans. The habituation process is careful and gradual, and it requires skill and patience and a deep knowledge of gorilla behavior to manage correctly, reading the group's signals and adjusting the approach to avoid pushing the animals past their tolerance. When it is complete, the habituated group treats the human observers as a familiar and non-threatening part of the environment. The gorillas moving around the seated observers, the infants approaching out of curiosity, the silverback occasionally making the short charge that is part of his management of any novel element in his range, the charge stopping a few meters from the observers and giving way to a return to whatever the silverback was doing before he decided to demonstrate his dominance. The tourist and the gorilla. The gorilla tourism that generates the revenue that funds the conservation that has kept the mountain gorilla alive is a carefully managed encounter, strictly limited in the number of humans permitted per group per day, strictly time limited to 1 hour of observation, strictly monitored for the health protocols that prevent the transmission of human respiratory diseases to the gorillas, who have no immunity to the common cold that could be fatal in a gorilla population. The tourists who pay the substantial permit fees to sit for an hour with a mountain gorilla group in the Virungas or in Bwindi describe the experience with a consistency of language that reflects the consistent nature of the encounter. They say it changed them. They say they did not expect to be moved in the way they were moved. They say the gorilla looked at them and they felt something they cannot adequately describe. They say it was one of the most significant experiences of their lives. Some of them become the advocates and the donors and the volunteers who sustain the conservation effort after they return home, the hour in the forest translating into the ongoing support that the conservation depends on. The gorilla looks at the tourist looks at the gorilla. Something happens between them that is difficult to name, but that reliably produces a connection that the tourist carries home and does not forget. What the gorilla sees. When the gorilla looks at the human observer sitting quietly in its range, it is seeing something that 8 million years of evolutionary history has not prepared it for, a primate of the same general body plan, but different proportions, lacking the gorilla's bulk and the silverback's silver fur and the heavy brow ridge, and in the same breath doing something recognizable, sitting quietly, making no threatening movements, making the same kind of sustained eye contact that gorillas make with each other in social assessment. The gorilla assesses the observer with the same cognitive apparatus it uses to assess every other individual in its social world, placing the observer in a category, determining the level of threat or interest the observer represents, adjusting its behavior in response to that assessment. The observer is categorized as neither threatening nor interesting enough to attend to continuously, and the gorilla returns to what it was doing. The social life of the group unfolding in the presence of the observers as if the observers were simply another feature of the environment, which is what they have become through the habituation process. The long list of what we do not know. The gorilla has been studied seriously for only about 60 years, since the pioneer work of George Schaller in the 1950s and Dian Fossey from 1967, and 60 years is not long enough to answer all the questions about a species whose individuals live for 40 years, and whose social groups persist over decades, and whose cultural traditions may be transmitted over generations. We do not fully understand the gorilla's cognitive capacity for self-recognition or theory of mind. We do not fully understand the function of all of its vocalizations. We do not fully understand the mechanisms of group fusion and fission, the conditions under which groups split or merge. We do not fully understand the gorilla's parasite ecology and the health implications of the parasite communities that live in and on it. We do not fully understand the long-term effects of climate change on the forest ecology that sustains it, and therefore on the gorilla's future. The gorilla is not fully known. It is not fully understood. It is an animal that continues to surprise the researchers who study it, that produces behaviors that require revision of the current models, that reveals in each decade of study something that the previous decade did not know. The gorilla is still surprising us, and this is both a reason for humility about what we think we know and a reason for continued attention, because the surprises have consistently moved in the direction of greater complexity, greater intelligence, greater social sophistication than the models predicted. The night in the forest is settling toward the deepest hours now, the hours when the calls of even the nocturnal animals become less frequent, and the forest has the quality of holding its breath. The way a deep forest at 4 in the morning has a stillness that is different from any other stillness, a depth of quiet that is the quiet of a complex system at its minimum activity. The millions of organisms that constitute the forest's life, all at whatever minimum they reach in the cycle of the day and the night. The photosynthesis stopped, the insects at their least active, the mammals at their deepest sleep. The drip of the water from leaf to leaf, the only continuous sound. The gorilla is in this stillness, in the center of it, in the nest in the forest in the dark of Central Africa, and the infant is sleeping, and the silverback is sleeping, and the forest is breathing, and the carbon is being absorbed, and the seeds that were deposited yesterday in the dung of the feeding gorillas are beginning the slow chemical process of stratification that will eventually trigger their germination. Life is continuing at the cellular and the chemical level, even in the stillness of the deep night. The processes that constitute life not pausing, even when the organisms that house them are fully asleep. You are fully asleep now, or nearly. The night is the same night that covers the forest, and the gorilla, and the infant in its mother's arms, and the silverback in his large nest, and the juveniles in their smaller nests at the edges of the resting cluster. The same dark, the same quiet, the same planetary night that covers everything and holds everything, and from which the morning comes, as it always comes, as it has always come, for 8 million years of gorilla mornings in the African forest. The silverback will wake tomorrow and lead the group to the food. The infant will nurse and grow. The forest will continue. And you will wake, as the gorilla wakes, into the morning that follows this night, into whatever your day holds, carrying in your body the rest that the night provides, the rest that 8 million years of evolution has built the body to receive and to use, the rest that is the foundation of everything the day requires. Sleep now. The gorilla is in the forest. The forest is old. The dark holds everything. The morning will come. Sleep. The gorilla and the other animals of the forest. The Congo Basin forest is not a monoculture of gorillas. It is a community of hundreds of species interacting in complex webs of dependence and competition and mutual accommodation, and the gorilla is one part of that community, a significant part, a part that shapes the forest's structure and composition in measurable ways, but one part among many. The forest elephant, moving through the same forest on paths that have been used by elephants for centuries, opens the canopy where it pushes through the vegetation and creates the clearings where light reaches the forest floor and the plants that require direct sunlight grow. The leopard, the gorilla's most significant predator, is present in the forest in low densities, hunting primarily at night and targeting the smaller and the more vulnerable animals, but occasionally taking a gorilla infant or a juvenile that has strayed from the group. The okapi, the forest giraffe, browses in the understory of the same forest, its striped hindquarters and its long prehensile tongue giving it access to the vegetation of a different layer from the gorilla's preferred feeding zone. All of them together, the gorilla and the elephant and the leopard and the okapi and the thousands of other species, constitute the Congo Basin forest ecosystem, each one playing its specific functional role, each one dependent on the others in ways that are more complex and more interconnected than any simple description can capture. The gorilla's seed dispersal sustains the fruit trees that feed the gorilla, and also the forest pigs and the squirrels and the birds that eat the same fruit. The gorilla's dung enriches the soil that supports the forest floor vegetation that feeds the forest buffalo and the bongo antelope and the forest joikas. The gorilla's ranging opens the vegetation along the paths it uses regularly and creates the micro-disturbances that allow particular plant species to establish themselves and that contribute to the patchwork of the forest's composition. The gorilla is not simply living in the forest. It is, in the accumulated actions of its daily life, helping to create the forest, maintaining it, shaping it into the specific form that its specific community of organisms requires. The sound of the forest at dawn. If you have ever been in a tropical forest at the moment of first light, you know that the transition from night to dawn is one of the most dramatic acoustic events that the natural world produces. The first light triggering a cascade of calls from the birds and frogs that have been waiting, in some biological sense, for the precise moment of the light's threshold to begin the dawn chorus that fills the forest from the ground to the canopy with a density and a variety and a volume of sound that has no equivalent in the temperate world. The dawn chorus of the Congo Basin forest is one of the most complex acoustic events on Earth, hundreds of species calling simultaneously in overlapping patterns of frequency and timing that sound to the human ear. Like chaos, but that are, to the species involved, a structured communication environment in which each signal is specific and recognizable and serves a specific function, the males establishing territory and advertising their fitness, and the females assessing the signals, and the predators listening for the specific distress calls that indicate prey in difficulty. The gorilla wakes into this sound. The silverback opens his eyes as the first light reaches the nest, and the forest begins its morning acoustic performance. And the sound of the forest at dawn is the sound that the silverback has been waking to for every morning of his 20-year life. The same species, the same patterns, the familiar acoustic landscape of the known forest that is as much a part of home as the specific trees and the specific roots and the specific faces of the group members. The familiar sounds of the forest at dawn are the sensory equivalent of waking in your own bed, in your own room, in your own home. The sounds of the known place at the known time, signaling safety and continuity and the beginning of another day in the life that the gorilla leads. The female gorilla's choice. Much of the discussion of gorilla social life centers on the silverback, the dominant male, the decision maker. But the females in a gorilla group are not passive recipients of the silverback's decisions. They are active participants in the social life of the group, making their own choices about proximity and affiliation and transfer, exercising agency within the constraints of the group's social structure. A female who chooses to leave a group and join a different male is making a significant decision about her reproductive future, assessing the available alternatives and choosing based on criteria that reflect her reproductive interests. The quality of the silverback, the size and composition of the group, the range quality of the territory the group occupies. The female's choice is constrained by the power structures of gorilla society in ways that the choices of human females in egalitarian societies are not. But within those constraints, the female gorilla exercises real agency, makes real choices, and those choices determine the composition of gorilla groups over time. The Dian Fossey legacy. The gorilla is more widely known and more intensively protected today than it would be without the life and work of Dian Fossey, the American researcher who spent 18 years in the Virunga Mountains studying the mountain gorillas, and who was killed in her cabin at the Karisoke Research Center in 1985, in circumstances that have never been fully resolved. Fossey was not the first person to study gorillas scientifically, but she was the person who brought the mountain gorilla's existence and its endangerment to the attention of the world in a way that no previous researcher had managed, through her research publications and her popular writing and the National Geographic coverage of her work that reached millions of people, and created the mountain gorilla as a subject of public concern and public affection. The Gorillas in the Mist film that told her story, released in 1988, extended that awareness to an even larger audience and produced a generation of people who knew what mountain gorillas were and why they mattered, and who carried that knowledge and that concern into their adult lives and their decisions about conservation. Fossey's methods were sometimes controversial, her confrontational approach to the poachers who operated in the Virungas, earning her enemies as well as allies, and the debate about the right approach to conservation in communities where the human needs are pressing and the alternatives to poaching are limited, has continued since her death. But the population of mountain gorillas is larger now than it was when she began her work, and the research infrastructure at Karisoke and the conservation framework for the Virungas that she helped to build are still functioning, still generating the data and the protection that the mountain gorilla's survival requires. Her name is still invoked in the conservation discussions of the Virungas and in the classrooms where conservation biology is taught. And the gorillas she named and whose social lives she documented in her journals are the ancestors of the gorillas that are alive and being observed and protected in the Virungas today. The breath of the sleeping forest. The Congo Basin forest, because of its size and its density, contributes more to the global water cycle than any other terrestrial ecosystem except the Amazon. The evapotranspiration of the forest, the water that the trees draw from the soil and release through their leaves in the process of photosynthesis, contributes moisture to the atmosphere that becomes rain, falling not only within the forest, but also further downwind. The forest creating its own rain through the water it releases, a biological process that modulates the regional climate and sustains the productivity of the agricultural lands that surround the forest. The gorilla, moving through this forest and contributing to its maintenance through its seed dispersal and its nutrient cycling, is part of the biological machinery that keeps this water cycle running. One small part of the enormous and complex process by which the forest breathes, and in breathing creates the conditions for its own continuation. The resting posture of the gorilla. When the gorilla sits in its afternoon rest, after the morning's feeding and before the afternoon's feeding, it adopts a posture that is familiar in the same way that many gorilla postures are familiar, sitting upright with the legs loosely crossed or extended, the arms resting on the knees or hanging at the sides, the head forward and slightly down, in the attitude of an animal that is fully relaxed but not fully inattentive, still monitoring the environment with the peripheral awareness that is the gorilla's baseline state when it is not actively feeding or traveling. In this posture, the gorilla looks like someone resting, not performing rest, not the exaggerated horizontal collapse of an exhausted animal, but the easy, comfortable sitting rest of an animal that is taking a break in the middle of a day that has been and will continue to be primarily about eating, that is digesting and waiting and available to whatever social interaction the group produces in the next hour. The gorilla in its rest posture is the most immediately recognizable of all the gorilla's postures, the one that most consistently triggers in human observers the recognition of something known, something familiar, something that belongs to the same biological category as themselves. Let your body settle into that same quality of rest now, the comfortable sitting or lying that is not the tension of effort and not the dissolution of unconsciousness, but the middle state, the state of the body fully supported and the mind loosely present and the breathing slow and even. The gorilla is in that state, in its nest, in the forest, in the night. You are in that state, in your own place, in your own night. The biological similarity between you is 46% different DNA and 54% the same. And the 54% that is the same includes the neurotransmitter systems that regulate sleep, and the hormonal systems that govern rest, and the physiological processes that the body performs in the hours of the night to repair and restore itself. The gorilla sleeps the same sleep. The gorilla's body does the same work in the dark hours that your body does, the same cellular maintenance, the same memory consolidation, the same preparation for the day that follows. 8 million years of the same sleep, the same dark, the same rest, the same morning coming after. The forest holds the gorilla, the night holds you. The dark holds everything, sleep. The silverback is breathing in his nest. The infant is against its mother. The forest is going on, and you are asleep in the same ancient dark, in the same rest that the body has been coming to at the end of every day, for as long as there have been bodies to rest. Sleep. The morning will come. Sleep.